You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf-help guide to all things Slavic. I'm Cameron Lalana, and if you want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture, then you're in the right place. Today, we are finally, after 5 months, coming back to Chevengur, covering the back half of the novel, which is made up of chapters 25 through 43. I apologize for my voice. I've come down with a bit of a cold, but I did promise it'd come out tomorrow, so here we are. I am so glad we are finally back at Chevengur, despite it may not seem that way with the time difference between the two, but it was a great joy to finish the second half of the novel, which becomes almost a completely different thing. Although that does not mean you should detach it from the first half. But if you have not yet read Chevengur, I cannot recommend it enough. It is such an interesting look at the rise of communism in the early USSR from the perspective of a believer, one who saw things actually happening and changing, not from the inside of an office, but from a lot of the rural areas that made up most of the country, where Platonov was actually out working, was building sort of the electric future, creating dams, lots of ponds, all these things. So we're not coming at this from the perspective of someone who's just inside the cities, and this is kind of a unique perspective, and one that was, not that popular, right? Platonov writes this, finishes the novel in 1928, and tries to get it published, but it does not end up being published for reasons you'll probably get once we get further in, or if you've already read Chevengur, you can already understand. It kind of falls in that category as a lot of Grossman's work with the Stalingrad and Life and Fate, or more so Life and Fate, where it's like, you really thought you were going to get that published, huh? Although for Platonov, to be fair, things were much different in 1928 than they were in the 50s when Grossman is trying to get Life and Fate published. So if you want to hear more about Andrei Platonov himself, you can pop back to episode 1, which I will link in the description of this episode, or you can go 8 or 9 episodes back, however far that was. 8 or 9 might be generous to my production speed. So Chevengur, if you want more story background, right, I think we also covered that in the last episode, but this is a novel that Platonov did try to get published. This was not one of those novels we talk about being for the drawer. Again, 1928, different period. Platonov did try to get it published. He even sent it to Maxim Gorky, whom most literature went through, and Gorky told him in no uncertain terms that this was not going to be published. So the novel would not be published until much, much later, earlier outside the Soviet Union, but I think in the Soviet Union it wouldn't be until 1988 that it's actually published. Although I'm going off my notes there, just remembering what I've read somewhere, so could be plus or minus 2 years on that one. But before we actually talk about what happens in part 2, with the back half of Chevengur, when we actually get to Chevengur itself, very much the Stalingrad style of storytelling here, arriving at the city, or at least our friendly commissar arriving at the city at the very end, I do want to talk to you about a couple things to pay attention to as we talk about the plot. Now, the first thing is that I want to encourage you to not get caught up on the literal plot and look more at the character's journey, which sounds like it's splitting hairs, and it kind of is, because we typically do focus more on the journey than the plot. But I do want to emphasize that point, because I've been poking around. My bad habit, as I've talked about, is seeing how other people react to novels or movies that we're covering on this podcast. And usually, I don't know why I keep bringing it up. Usually the thing I see most often is, I'm confused about this, which is what we're here for. But I did see people getting caught up on, like, I don't understand this particular thing. I don't want you to get caught up on that when you read this novel if you haven't read it yet, because I think the meat of the novel is found in how our characters are thinking about things and reacting to events, or more often kind of not reacting that much, which is not to say that you should ignore the action in the plot, but don't get caught up. There is an attack later in the novel. I've seen people asking, who carried out that attack? It's not entirely clear. Why did that happen? And I don't think that's an important question. That's less important than the fact that it did happen. We get to see how the characters react to it and think about it, and that's the really important thing to pay attention to. So if you're kind of confused about a plot action, don't get caught up on that. Let the characters' reactions be the thing you're taking away from it. And for number 2, let me give you a few perspectives on the novel, but also Platonov more in general, from an article, Danger and Deliverance, reading Andrei Platonov, written by Angela Livingston. She starts off this article by giving us 3 frames of reference into Platonov's style from Valery Podoroga, Joseph Brodsky, and Olga Mirsin. Podoroga, quote, describes Platonov's style as the product of his unusual ability to see everything as it is seen by the, quote, eunuch of the, quote, within a quote, eunuch of the soul. That imagined non-participant observer of all an individual's actions, resembling a concierge on duty. He shows how Platonov, describing solely that which is not understood, brings about a painful alienation of the reader. Joseph Brodsky, quote, Platonov forces us to castigate ourselves for bad thinking. Brodsky sees him as revealing a kind of sinfulness in the Russian language, a proclivity for dead ends, a blind alley mentality in the language itself. And finally, Olga Mirsin, quote, she looks piercingly into the linguistic structures that carry the peril and argues that through a device of non-estranging the strange and normalizing the abnormal, Platonov catches us in a snare, makes us read about weird and horrific matters without questioning them. This is because, again and again, his only slightly extraordinary language about the weird, the horrific, brings to mind the ordinary, colloquial or official, language which he has avoided, so that, supposing he has used the latter, we swiftly read on. By failing to take in the non-ordinary words, but instead automatically correcting them, that is, by not noticing that the author is really is saying the things he is saying, we become uncomfortably co-responsible for the abnormalities we have not reacted against. Only upon rereading will we grasp what has happened. Livingston argues that that is both damaging and restorative to the reader. These phenomenons that Livingston brings in from other critics and writers. Damaging and restoring the reader through the sense of that you kind of, I think you trust the novel typically. You trust the language you're reading outside of cases where you might be asking yourself, is this an unreliable narrator? But the text itself is kind of tricking you a little bit. Not, maybe tricking isn't the right word, but the text is kind of inviting you to maybe not have the perspective that you would had this same event been described in other language. But at the same time, there's also little hints in the novel that allow you to stop and catch yourself and reread and notice these things, which is ultimately restorative. Brings you in more as an active participant. For her part, Livingston describes it thusly. Quote, Platonov the novelist seems not to want to persuade anyone of anything, nor to ask his reader to feel any particular feelings. It could be said that the main feature of his style is precisely the careful and conspicuousness with which he expresses the subtle and important things he has to say, which otherwise, given emphasis, might be ravaging of the reader, causing the pain Podoroga speaks of, the guilt Mirsin analyzes, and the entrapment and cul-de-sacs Brodsky briefly but sharply invokes. Yet, the unvoiced and profoundly unsentimental tenderness is often present in his accounts of situations, which, under another pen, could easily provoke over-easy emotion. Think back to the beginning of the novel when we are dealing with this village under a time of famine, with people dying in droves, mothers killing their children, and again, to take Mirsin's language, this very non-extraordinary, only slightly extraordinary language in the way that this is happening, a sort of passive acceptance. This is how things are. We don't have the power to change it, you might think. It's like reading, I assume most people who are listening to this probably have not read a lot of police press releases, but if you've worked in news, you've had to read a lot of those, and right, that's something equivalent to this in my mind. The reading of horrible things happening in very regular language, although maybe regular language is an overstatement. There's a whole vocabulary unique to police press releases, but it is merely a fact. This has happened. You read it, okay, that's happened. Someone was shot, someone died, yada, yada, yada. This novel, even though that's not using language in the same way, I think Livingston is arguing for that kind of tendency that you might take to a press release into this novel as well. However, as you will note at the end of that quote there is still a tenderness in this only slightly extraordinary language, which still is like those little peeks behind the curtain. I would encourage you to read this article in whole, but Livingston brings up this particular line from the very beginning about the children dying, and the line is, the children themselves died in advance. And on one hand, you have this very regular, again, slightly extraordinary language, this big mass of children, a horrific thing to have so many children die, but it's said very plainly. They themselves died in advance. And yet, there's this tenderness that Livingston argues exists in that word themselves. Livingston can argue better than I can. You can read that piece, but it kind of draws you in to almost just barely see the fact that these children are living beings capable of understanding what happens around them, almost as if the children had seen what was happening and said what was coming, right? This is happening in advance, and said, okay, well, I guess it's time to die. And that may not itself be a very comforting thing, but it is, even though it's not stated, that one word, themselves, gives them that sort of agency, that sort of invites you in to see the individual perspective in these things, even though it's not actually invoked. That's kind of what I think, as I understood it, how Livingston is describing this action of damage, this easy way you can read past that simple line, which happens in the middle of a broader paragraph. But also, if you are stopping and reading carefully, you can have that restorative moment of seeing through this only slightly extraordinary language into the reality of the people behind it. Of course, these people are not real, but describing situations that certainly did happen. The third thing I want to talk about comes from David Bethia's book, The Shape of Apocalypse in Modern Russian Fiction, specifically the chapter Chevengur, On the Road with Bolshevik Utopia. You can find that on JSTOR. It is, again, also worth a read, as Bethia defines in much greater depth apocalyptic fiction versus utopian fiction, which Bethia argues are essentially end-of-history plots. The former, apocalyptic fiction, which in this context is not like apocalyptic as we understand in general terms, is like the world has ended. Now you're following this person on their adventure, a la Mad Max, I don't know, the Book of Eli, many other stories like this nuclear apocalypse typically, but sort of the traditional apocalypse, the mythical end of the world, which is traditionally an end of history that comes from outside, or in Bethia's language, without history, which is to say something like an external force like God or a God comes down and imposes an end of the world. Whereas utopian fiction, on the other hand, is an end of the world that comes from within, or in plain language, people themselves creating this end state to history. Bethia writes about utopian fiction, quote, "The difficulty in telling of utopia in story form, of course, is that the guiding viewpoint is not really outside the text, but inside it, belonging not to God, but the author. It's sort of not two utopians talking to each other about the world they live in typically. It's typically an insider speaking to you, the outsider reader," which also, these two plots also have a third one, which you might be already thinking about, the anti-utopia. Stepping outside the academic jargon, we'd probably more commonly call this dystopia. Bethia writes, quote, "The anti-utopian fears the inhuman ends promised by utopia and the violent means often used to achieve those ends, and hence will opt for the openness of, quote, being human over an idea that is either utopian, permanently achieved within history, or apocalyptic, resolved by God, the other at the conclusion to the biblical plot. That is to say, the authorial viewpoint guiding anti-utopia is fervently human, but not necessarily hopeful. It rejects the desirability of any polis governed by authority, patriarchy, order from above, in favor of fraternity or sorority, a freely chosen, loosely organized, even anarchistic kinship." And you can think of, as Bethia evokes, Yevgeny Zamyatin's We as a great example of that, with the choices that our characters make at the end of that. You can check out our episode on We from many years ago at this point. This is important to pay attention to because the back half of Chevengur is profoundly different from the front half. We go from this picturesque romp around the country to, find communism, to the somewhat dirty work of actually building communism. Except in Platonov's case, its builders hardly have a better idea of what communism is than the people they're imposing it on. And this is where Bethia notes Platonov as being very different from these traditional storylines, these traditional plots. Unlike that traditional utopian method of an insider talking to you, the outsider reader, it is between these people themselves, the attempted utopians themselves. This is not a novel from the vanguard as we'd understand it in the Leninist sense. The Revcom, a revolutionary committee in Chevengur, does technically fit that definition, but they just barely fit the notion of being conscious in the revolutionary sense. They know the language, but they don't have any practical understanding of what capitalism, communism, proletarians, bourgeois are. They're vibing it out essentially, which is, if you read the literature of the time, historical literature, is something that did happen. One of the issues that the Soviets ran into with the anti-kulak campaign, let's call it, is that a lot of people just had a very loose definition of what a kulak was, often including people that they personally had something to get one over on. But this utopian to utopian viewpoint is one of the really remarkable things about Chevengur. It's entirely focused on the actual building of this utopia of this nation from the worm's eye view, not concerned with the big ideals, the high-minded vanguard, but with the actual people of the rural region it portrays. It's kind of hard to extract this or see it outside Platonov's experience working as an engineer in rural regions, bringing dams and infrastructure to these places. And it makes sense that after seeing how things were happening from between the workers and this, I'm gonna call them, I don't think it technically fits, but I'll call them the vanguard elements who are building communism in these regions, were implementing their policies. Now, Bethia argues that Platonov is actually reflecting all three plots within this novel. Quote, Andrei Platonov represents the collision of the Christian apocalyptic and Marxist utopian models of meaning coming from without, as opposed to within history. Platonov's, he writes later on, Platonov's position in this tradition of utopians and anti-utopians is also peculiar. His mature works, such as Chevengur, are neither fully utopian nor fully anti-utopian. His sympathies are clearly on the side of the Duraki, the simple folk and peripatetic visionaries who are the post-1917 equivalent of the traditional Russian truth seeker and fool in Christ. But his actual experience of the manifest failures of utopianism as worldview tell him that in reality history's road may not and probably does not have a terminus. Bethia goes on to argue that Nikolai Fyodorov, a Russian philosopher, was a major influence on Platonov, which is an interesting choice for an atheist, as Platonov was, because Fyodorov is arguing from a very strictly religious point of view, but we do know that he had read quite extensively the Fyodorov's work, The Philosophy of the Common Cause. This is how Bethia talks about Fyodorov's belief as is relevant here, which I was going to try to rephrase to avoid too much quotation at the beginning here, but yeah, I'm not even going to try to summarize a secondhand account of what Fyodorov believes. I think that would just be drifting too far without me going and reading Fyodorov myself. But, quote, to put simply what is stated in many complex permutations over more than 1,000 pages, Fyodorov believed that a negative apocalypse of divine judgment, a decision by God to enter history because humanity has not been able to live up to its Christian duty towards itself and its members, could be averted if we turned our energies toward the proper task. He called the apocalypse of judgment a, quote, transcendental resurrection, end quote, or a punishment that would occur when the resistance to the divine will have reached its ultimate degree. But this sort of apocalypse was not inevitable. If we could join in viewing history differently with genuine Christian imagination, if we would give way to imminent resurrection. History is always the process of resurrection, not judgment, because the subject of history is not the living, but those who have died. And in order to judge, it is first necessary to resurrect those who have already borne the supreme punishment, the death penalty. Fyodorov's Common Cause, which would have struck a kindred utopian chord in Platonov, was nothing less than the literal resurrection from the molecules up of our dead, dispersed ancestors and the Edenic greenering of the universe's vast pockets of aridity and uninhabitability through the miracles of modern science. End quote. Sorry, that is a very long passage, but it does feel essential to really kind of, quote unquote, getting this novel. It's an argument that Platonov is seriously engaging with this notion of that common cause in a religious context. This question of how to bring people together, how to turn proletarians into a homo sovieticus, the new Soviet man, although the novel doesn't use that language. This question of the place of technology to make this end of history, which is a lot more complex here in Chevengur than you'll find in other novels we've covered in this time. These are all things that Platonov is engaging with throughout Chevengur. What is that common cause? How can we avert this apocalypse in a manner of speaking through this building up of treatment correctly of other people? And the collision between all of those factors in the reality of Chevengur, it produces this state that Bethia calls being a failed utopian, a true believer who saw the cracks, thus the novel. Bethia also makes this other argument, which I think is also very important for understanding this novel. Quote, he, Platonov, saw the kind of character study which focuses on one unique and fully realized individual, the traditional hero of the bourgeois novel, at the expense of the rest of humanity to be selfish, unbrotherly, Following Fyodorov, Platonov would say, and does so often in Chevengur, that the umnik, or thinker, spends time devising abstract schemes of human engineering that have no practical relevance for the worker, while the worker, worn out by labor, has no time or energy to think. Hence words, according to Platonov, like all tools of human endeavor, should be wielded in the service of a higher goal, that of bringing the umnik and the durak together in linguistic brotherhood. Here, however, in a thoroughgoing democratization of narrative voice, the point of departure is almost exclusively that of the durak. Better to begin the search for utopian unity by plumbing those inchoate feelings of the simple people than to attempt to raise those feelings into the bright flare of articulate thought. The result of this democratization, as shall be seen, is the simultaneous demotion of promotion of the hero and the genre he represents to the story of every man on the circuitous road to a better life. He goes on to write, the novel is compositionally the opposite of a Bildungsroman. The temporal unfolding of Sasha's life is not accompanied by a growth in knowledge, a sense of domestic or societal fitting in, but a slow, ultimately triumphant groping for the truth. Sasha does not become a parent, nor does he resurrect one, harkening back to Fyodorov's argument that one of the primary features of averting this apocalypse is coming into kinship with one's ancestors, in a manner of speaking. Kind of resurrecting them from the death they've been sort of resurrecting them, in this case more figuratively, from the death to which they've been subjected. But going back to it, Sasha does not become a parent, nor does he resurrect one. The secret of death to which his father once laid claim on, and which made the son an orphan, remains just that. In other words, Chevengur does not have the answers to these questions, but it does take the questions very seriously because they are being addressed. In other words, Chevengur does not have the answers, but it does take those questions very seriously. So when we see these tropes of apocalyptic or utopian or even somewhat anti-utopian fiction, we should understand them not necessarily in the context of the novel or the plot as a whole is the key element there, but as a part of that individual character's journey, because each of these characters is sort of on their own road. As you're doing this, Bethia also argues against being too literal. Quote, Platonov does not fill in these synecdochic spaces. The horse's leg plus the fatigue of expended energy equals time/space traversed equals stillness/end of life, with a tight causality, but allows them, as it were, free reign. In other words, I don't know if Bethia would agree with this characterization, but this is how I'm understanding it in plain language. Platonov is an author who's not creating tight, logical, textual motifs, but someone who is evoking feelings for the character and for you to explore. Okay. Sorry, that's a very long preamble into talking about the novel itself, but keep those things in mind. One, let's think about these individual characters' journey. Two, let's look at the language that Platonov is using, which is not necessarily arguing for you to believe a certain manner, a certain perspective on the world, but is inviting you sort of to engage with the very fact of the world around you using this very only slightly extraordinary language. And three, Platonov as a failed utopian, as someone who is really trying to engage with these end of history ideas that are going around at the time. Four is actually just coming back around to pay attention to the tropes again, but don't try to look for specific literal meanings rather than the way they're engaged with by these characters. Okay, let's talk about Chevengur 25 to 43 now. So we rejoin Sasha Dvanov as he's returning to the capital of this region in order to deliver his report, which Shumilin kind of chastises him for. It says, you were supposed to go out and find communism, and you're going about trying to change these things yourself, and you don't really seem to have a good understanding of what we're doing here. But all the same, Shumilin invites Dvanov to a meeting in the city where we meet another character, an engineer, Gulpner, who becomes very important in the plot later on. And I just want to stop and say that this chapter 26 is such an exceptional chapter in the novel, this meeting, because it really it is a fantastic example of how Platonov writes such full worlds. As we're sitting with this meeting, you feel the heat that all of them are dealing with, their individual thoughts for some of these characters who will never show up again, the emotions pressing upon them on old war heroes who are now shockingly in charge of these institutions, who are shockingly because they're shocked by the power they now wield, by the people who are already tired of building communism and want to building communism in a figurative sense, the communism of state, of bureaucratic building, of papers, of notes that need to be given. He wants to build communism with his hands. And all while this is happening, there's this stifling heat. The power keeps going out. You jump over to the power station, hearing a little bit about how these engineers have learned to keep things working, with this great line about how they had become adept at maintaining, using machines which had long outlived their lifespan. Kind of metaphorical of the revolution as a whole. These people using these institutions that existed to try to keep things going. It's just fantastic. I love the fullness that Platonov brings to his world. It's not like this very simple he said, she said kind of storytelling that you sometimes see. There's even this moment of reflection there too, where you have this brief. Most of the novel is told, literally as is, following along, but you've got this brief moment where the novel implies a perspective from the future too, when the secretary is asking for advice, and no one says anything, and he kind of says, "Damn you all! I'm not giving you proclamations. I'm genuinely asking for advice. I don't know things any better than you. I'm not any smarter than the rest of you." And then Gopner, the engineer, says, "Yes, you're not any smarter than us, but if you're ever get any more stupid than us, we will certainly throw you out." Quote, "The meeting laughed contentedly. In those days, there was no defined cadre of famous people. On the contrary, everyone felt his own proper name and significance." Going back to this notion of a failed utopian, you kind of see someone, this in those days. That's the kind of language you do not see very often in this novel. This slight hinting at the future, which is mournful of what it was. It's great. There's a lot of humor throughout the section. But outside this meeting, Dvanov and Gopner meet this man talking to himself, who they find out is the chairman of the Revolutionary Committee from the city of communism, formerly known as Chevengur. He invites them to come see the city where they have built communism. And as all this is going on, you should also know that the city has come under a new set of rules, which I hope you're familiar with, the new economic policy, the NEP, which is causing some consternation, right? If you're not familiar with the NEP, that is the economic policy that was instituted shortly after the Civil War, when the USSR was incorporating, allowed for kind of free and private trade, which births this generation of so-called NEP men and NEP women who make their living off of bringing goods to places, setting up stores, selling them, things that you will not see for very long in the Soviet Union. And that causes a lot of back and forth. If you recall, Cement, one of the major points of the novel, at least for me, is when the two sort of truest Marxists, those who have read Marx the most thoroughly and are most ardent that this is a counter-revolutionary effort, end up being expelled because they are no longer useful to the Revolutionary Committee, or whereas they end up keeping on the old Tsarist official who, while not sharing their beliefs exactly, is useful for his practical understanding of how to build bureaucracies and systems. And you kind of see in that novel the sort of death of idealism in the face of, I don't want to say practical reality, because I don't think it necessarily is practical, but on the other hand, I think it is. I think it's a fitting word, practical, and but not entirely optimistic, because those ideological elements can just help you build that future with the sort of perspective, at least as I take from the novel, like, I hope our children can forgive us for what we've done in this era, because we built them such a good world. Now, the chairman of Chevengur, which as it will be referred to through the rest of the novel, is this very particular character, because at the very beginning you get the sense that he's this upright communist. You might initially assume, being the chairman of the committee, he is as educated in theory as the rest of them, but you get this hint that things are not quite that sense when he, in the next morning, ends up arguing with a peasant who's brought food to the marketplace. Now, this peasant is engaging with what is allowed by the NEP, this free exchange, by bringing his goods to the market, but he's not in the same category as the NEP men and NEP women. He and the other peasants they don't have as much to offer. They're bringing their wares out from the countryside. They're treated fairly badly. As is mentioned in the novel, they are not harassed at the gates this particular day, but that only grows their anxiety, because that means they must be coming around to do something to us later. And Cheporny kind of goes up and starts calling him a leech and all these things, even though these are all technically allowed. But the villager ends up arguing back to him, and he actually ends up respecting that. And we get this insight into how Cheporny sees things at this point in time. Quote, "Back in the days when he'd stay in an office, he had entertained the pitiful thought that the villages were inhabited by people utterly identical to one another who didn't know how to continue their lives. It had seemed to him that, left to themselves, they would simply die out, which meant that his thoughtful care was essential to the entire district. Since he had begun to ride around the district, however, he had become convinced of the personal mind of each citizen and had long since abolished all administrative help to the population. And this elderly peasant had once again confirmed Cheporny's simple feeling that every living person gets to know his own fate while still inside his mother's belly and has no need of supervision. That's where you get that first big sense. There's something very different about Cheporny and how he's approaching this, as will be elaborated on more. Cheporny's vision of communism is not of state building per se. It is of, I'm going to use anarchy in a sense here. Anarchy in the very technical definition of, not having the system power of governance, because the Revolutionary Committee and Chevengur does not do anything. It does not require any work. It does not require any money to be given. It does not pay its dues to the Communist Party, to the Bolsheviks more broadly. It does not accept any money from them. It just lets anyone kind of do anything. They're barely, they are there to give commands in a certain sense, but they're not there to guide the people towards a certain future. As Cheporny at this point in the novel sees it, they are simply there to shepherd communism in, which is kind of coming around on its own. It's this perspective that Shumilin sort of has in the beginning when he sends, not a perspective per se, but Shumilin tentatively sends Sasha Dvanov off to go search for the possibility of this happening. And Cheporny, who is in charge of one of these sorts of places, says, I don't really need to do anything. It's already happening. Every person kind of understands their own fate. And what better way to create communism than to let them go to it? However, there are some rubs in there, which we'll get to later. So Sasha kind of says, "Yeah, I'd be interested. You should go get my comrade Kopyankin, who is no longer with Dvanov at this point." And he leaves Chevengur, feeling freer outside the city. And eventually, Kopyankin, who is outside the city somewhere else, actually runs into Cheporny asleep on his horse. Kopyankin, at this point, when we rejoin him, he is talking with three peasants, telling them that socialism meant water on the high steppe, where, quote, excellent land was going to waste. So we can see Kopyankin, again, whose main idea, if you don't recall, his vision of socialism is kind of that which makes Rosa Luxemburg proud, right? The communism he's writing towards is whatever Rosa is fighting for, and what exactly she was fighting for, he doesn't really know, but he kind of has a sense of what would make Rosa proud. But here he's parroting Sasha Dvanov for his view of communism, which again, Dvanov himself does not have a very developed idea of it either. He didn't join the Bolsheviks because of an ideological purpose. His father, Zakhar Pavlovich, literally dragged him to a table and says, you should sign up for this. And then he's kind of developing his theories as they go along in that first half of the novel, in that kind of picaresque romp. And this is Sasha's language. Kopyankin, in trying to explain to these peasants living among them, he kind of has this moment of this attack of nerves, a panic attack maybe, which his horse, the fantastically named Strength of the Proletariat, seems to understand, and suddenly, while he's on it, takes flight, takes him out into the countryside, where Kopyankin, now in motion, pay attention to that, he's on the road, in motion again, he begins to feel better, and it's during that flight where he finds Cheporny. Cheporny begins to explain what's happening in Chevengur to Kopyankin, who's somewhat doubtful, but Cheporny is not bothered by this because, quote, Cheporny, living in socialism, had long gotten out of the habit of calamitous anxiety on behalf of anyone defenseless and loved. In Chevengur, he had demobilized society along with the Tsar's army, since no one had wanted to expend their body for some general and visible good. What they had wanted was to see their own life returned to them from people who were close and comradely. So think again of Fyodorov, right? Creating that common cause of humanity, part of the process of averting the apocalypse. Here, too, Cheporny is kind of expressing that. He is looking for what, to people creating their own lives, this end of history and communism, in relation not to the building of a state, but in relation to the people around them, the people who are close and comradely. That's something we'll keep engaging with throughout this novel, is like, how do you create those bonds between people? What even are those bonds between people? And so they go to Chevengur. And this is, in Chevengur, this is an interesting part as you kind of begin to hear about the town. And you'll see some, if you look up literature about this, you'll see a lot of it talking about time in Chevengur, because this introduction to Chevengur seems to mash eras in a sense, in that you have people arriving, people interested in this town of communism, but you also have the old Chevengurians, and you kind of learn more about the let's call them historical peoples, the people who lived there before, who were a kind of it seems to be a sect of old believers or another religious sect who is not inside the Orthodox Church exactly, but is kind of living out here in their beliefs, and who are deeply religious. Quote, during autumn gales, Chevengurians would lie down for the night on their floors to rest more steadily and be closer to the earth in their graves. Secretly, every one of them believed that the gale or heat wave in question might turn into the second coming, but none of them wanted to leave their homes prematurely or die before the fullness of their years. And so, after each gale, heat wave, or a spell of extreme cold, they would get together and drink tea. So we have this clashing here of literally the apocalyptic plot. These religious Chevengurians who are waiting for the second coming, waiting for that end of history from without, and Cheporny, who has arrived to end history from within. Now, as we'll learn later on, it does not appear to be the case that these Chevengurians are actually around, even though you might get the impression that these new arrivals to the town of communism, to Chevengur, are existing alongside these old Chevengurians. And there's also a great bit of humor as you are Cheporny noting when he'd first arrived, he sends out his members of the Revolutionary Committee to come understand what people even do here, and they come back and tell him that they're mostly waiting to die or for the second coming. And he says to them, did you tell them ending the world now would be a counter-revolutionary measure? To which one of the men points out to him, well, if the second coming happens and they take all the believers to heaven, that wouldn't actually be a problem for us, because that would leave us, the atheist communists, untouched and with less work to do, which he agrees with. You also get another hint at how unorthodox Cheporny's beliefs are, if you didn't already get that, when a man arrives to town who's very interested in worker cooperatives. And worker cooperatives are the basis of a lot of what's going to happen in these rural regions of the USSR, right? Getting away from the social revolutionary position in the Civil War, right? The faction who, more than anything, pushed for redistribution of lands from the big landlords, the aristocracy, into the hands of the peasants themselves individually. That differs pretty wildly from the Soviet perspective, which is that we need to be marshaling bigger, better powers. We need energy. We need collective farms so people can be producing on a much bigger scale and for a more united purpose than many myriad farming and farmers' families could do on their own. And so Alexei, this man, arrives to talk to Cheporny about cooperatives, which is the proper Soviet thing. And Cheporny says, kind of waves him off and says, look, we've already built communism. We don't need cooperatives. And he says to him, quote, now, my brother, all the paths have disappeared. Everyone has arrived. Note again, the path, the road, the one that makes Kopyankin feel better, those are all gone because everyone has arrived at the end of the road. Arrived where? Alexei Alexeyevich asked meekly, losing the cooperative hope in his heart. Where do you think? The communism of life. Have you read Karl Marx? No, Comrade Cheporny. Well, you really should, dear comrade. History has ended, and you haven't even noticed. And Alexei wanders off, feeling somewhat set adrift by the answer, and Kopyankin is worried about this. Now, Alexei kind of wanders off, feeling somewhat set adrift by this answer, and Kopyankin is worried by that, because he hasn't read Marx either. But Cheporny assures him neither is he, and he says, quote, and there's really no need to read anything at all. Again, I feel like I'm hammering on this point over and over again, but this is not about an intellectual engagement with Marxism in the rural regions. This story is following a bunch of people who don't know what they're talking about, but are developing their own relationship to these ideas. Kopyankin on his road with Rosa Luxemburg, this sort of Don Quixote-like figure, although Kopyankin, unlike Don Quixote, his Dulcinea is very real and very dead, and the enemies he's fighting are also very real. It's a darker, grittier Don Quixote, but one that is somewhat fantastical, whereas Cheporny is asserting that his road is ended because they've already reached this end of history. So they don't need to read anything, really. They don't need to read Marx. They don't need to read all these other things because they've already created it by giving people the communism of life, and what that means is never defined, and it doesn't need to be. And we have gone. And the interesting thing is that it's going to mention this old religious population is gone, which we'll talk about in a second. And they had been mostly waiting for salvation, and now we have instead this group of new proletarians who instead of doing nothing as they wait for salvation, do nothing as they await socialism. And when I mean do nothing, I mean that very literally. They do not farm. They do not fix things up. They're kind of hanging around the village, just waiting for something to happen, foraging, using up their supplies, not worried about replenishing them. And as Kopyankin is walking around trying to ascertain whether or not communism has been built here, he ends up talking to Prokofy Divanov. You may recall from the first half of the novel, Prokofy is the son of the family that Sasha Divanov was adopted into, the one who kind of asserted more authority over his parents to the point that he got Sasha kicked out of the family, who has always been this very transactional person. And from here on out, I'm just going to call them Prokofy and Sasha to avoid any misunderstandings between which of the Divanovs we're talking about. Kopyankin looks around and says, it seems like you're doing nothing. Who lived here before? These are not obviously not the original inhabitants of the town. And Prokofy says, the bourgeoisie. Me and Chapurny organized a second coming for them. And then Kopyankin says, that's not possible. We have science now. Prokofy says, think I'm some kind of storyteller? There was an unexpected event instigated by an ordinary committee. Extraordinary, you mean, says Kopyankin. Yes, that's it, the Cheka. And this is where we come back to Livingston's point of view, where these very, very strange things are said in very normal language. We have this implication. What happened to the people here? Oh, just an ordinary committee. You mean the extraordinary committee? Yes, the Cheka. And then they move on. This is an implication of something pretty horrific, which we'll get to in a little bit, that is just kind of glossed over. You might not even give it too much thought the first time you look around. Kopyankin rides around. He's not, after that conversation, he's not impressed with this. And it really begins to dawn on him that their conception of communism differs wildly from what he thinks. And he starts to yell at people and even chases a man through the streets, yelling at him about how they don't have communism. And, quote, sometimes the man turned around and yelled out reproaches, saying that in Chevengur, man neither labored nor ran, and that all taxes and obligations were now borne by the sun. And this is one of those interesting things I want to focus on, too, this idea, this trope of the sun. The sun, through the language of this novel, is stated over and over again, as is stated more often in other works of Platonov, is sort of the ultimate proletarian, because it exists. It is the reason why plants can grow. It is meant to do the work for these people. The environment around them kind of has socialism, has communism built into it, in a sense. So it's not necessary for people to do things to it. And this is a very different perspective from even other characters in the novel. Let's go back to this original character we followed for most of it, Zakhar Pavlovich, who is enamored with machinery. And this is sort of a much more traditional understanding of the revolution at the time, this interest in machinery, in the building of the future that way. He's a builder, he's a tinkerer, he loves trains. That's a big part of the early novel, great part of the novel. But I think it's also important to point out that Zakhar Pavlovich also has this moment of breaking with that. As he's looking out upon a train carrying a load of soldiers, he kind of has this thought. This is after Sasha joins the Red Army, I think, that he looks at it and says that, the train is beautiful, but the people on it don't really have any control over where it's going. The soldiers don't get to choose. They're simply getting on this mechanism. And he sort of has this break from that perspective, that machinery is the freeing of the people in the future because people are not getting more choice. And from that point on, in the few places where Zakhar Pavlovich appears, he is much more critical. He's much less of a believer in the Soviet Union to come, even though he's the one who encouraged Sasha to join the Bolsheviks. He's not seeing any real difference. In fact, when Sasha goes back to him to explain to him, the NEP has come, he says, when they first came, they promised everything. They promised we'd have whatever we wanted. Now that they're in power, they say there are social conditions, which means they can't. And there will always be those social conditions. And it makes sense because Satan didn't make it easy for priests to get to heaven. So he is that perspective of machine building saving the world. I wouldn't take that as I don't want to reduce his character to that, but that is an element in his own road, in his own plot. And you can contrast that with Sasha, who, as it is noted in the beginning of the novel, feels has a hard time talking about things because he doesn't want to say something without talking about its true and proper name. And he's looking out on the world, and he is also interested in machinery, but whereas Pavlovich is interested specifically in the machinery within this world, which has the possibility to make people happy, Sasha is looking to terraform the world itself. What is communism? Communism is when we can put a village on the high step, because no longer will a lack of water be an impediment to that. Now we can use piping to bring water up to them. Socialism is our mastery over the world itself. Here with the sun, we have an opposite point of view. The humans are not the masters of this land. They are inhabitants who are living in communism under the true proletarian, the sun, nature itself, which, as if socialism or communism exudes out from this force. The sun becomes like this symbolism of socialism itself, bringing things to them, lighting their way. Whereas at night, all these unknown people are all huddled together and holding each other for warmth, waiting for the sun to come back. The sun works on behalf of everybody, and this is through Chevenger's perspective mostly, right? People don't need to do any work because it would be wrong to impose one single law, frankly, Soviet law, upon these people, because everyone has their own fate, their own path to walk. And so let's let the universal proletarian, the sun, work on behalf of all of us and for the sake of everybody. And in fact, Prokofy, who is one of Chevenger's closest advisors, in fact, he seems to be, in the way that he is dominating of his family, he's also kind of dominating of this committee, even though he is not an actual leader. He is kind of their thinker. And you get the sense that he is... he also does not know what he's talking about. He is technically read Marx, but he doesn't have a better understanding of it than anybody else. Quote, at Chevenger's instigation, Prokofy had come up with a particular interpretation of labor, declaring it once and all for it to be a surviving remnant of bourgeois greed and animalism, exploitative voluptuousness. Since labor led to the creation of property, and property to oppression, the sun itself issues rations entirely adequate to support people, and any augmentation of these rations through deliberate human labor merely fed the bonfire of class warfare, since it led to the creation of superfluous, harmful objects. So the creation of communism here is the taking away of all things. So if there's no property, nothing can come between people. And Prokofy's road is a little bit different here. He's sort of this attempt at intellectualizing what they're doing here, but as you see throughout the novel, there is no consistency in this intellectualism. Prokofy is basically arguing for what benefits him best. This transactional nature we see in him as a child maintains here. You could maybe read that as striking out against intellectuals. I think it would be a little reductive to only see it as that, but I think that's an element in there. And we have here all these people, even though Prokofy is advising Chevenger, they clearly have very different perspectives on things. Prokofy, the sort of transactional proclamation-based communism, and Chevenger's sense that people will come to it themselves. Again, we get so many roads of these characters walking through this novel. We've got the city of crank communists, essentially, all arguing over what communism is without any of them actually engaging with any theory. All right, and I don't mean that as a criticism. This is... I reminded of a conversation I had a while ago with a young man who was talking about the end of the USSR and was asking me, didn't people feel cheated? Didn't they see that this was, what the wider world wanted to impose upon them, conditions of capitalism that would be beneficial to them and to the wider world, to the U.S. mostly, not to them. And I kind of had to say to him, well, if you talk to most people, this young man in college is very highly educated in politics, and you've got to understand, even in the USSR, most people are not. Most people don't actually look at things that way. They were looking for much simpler things. People at the end of the USSR were looking for consumer goods. They were looking for basic standards of living. And yes, what happens in the shock therapy of the introduction to communism, the introduction to capitalism in the now former territories of the USSR did, I'm going to understate it here, it did suck. It did not go well. It cheated a lot of people out of a stability they had before. And all the same, that's this perspective that the right way to see things is through the politically educated lens, is just not realistic, I think, to the way that most people tend to actually think and view the world. This is more reflective of the average person I talk to. And so I think it's a good thing to have a novel from this perspective, which is why I think Chevengur is so remarkable, in that it's really seriously and not paternalistically like, oh, isn't it nice that people think of these things this way, or isn't it silly? It takes these characters very seriously, and the one character who could be called an intellectual is one of the most ridiculous of all. In fact, he's the one you could most easily have revulsion for, as we talk about more throughout the novel. And as Chipurni is going around in this town, more things happen. But this episode would be a million years long if he talked about everything that happened in this novel. He finds the graveyard where the old Chevengurians are buried. And the text says this to us, which is not Kopyankin's perspective, but, quote, "The Chevengur bourgeoisie had been slaughtered definitively and conscientiously. Not even life beyond the grave could bring them away joy. After their bodies, their souls had been executed too." Again, kind of horrific. I would say you look at this and you might initially think that Mearson is overstating the normality of the language here. You look at that and say that's a pretty horrific thing to imagine, killing a whole town, even the killing of their souls in order to bring away communism. But again, in the context of these big long paragraphs, I'm highlighting it here, but this is a very dense novel. This is nearly 500 pages, and you just get little hints like that. And if you are just reading and going, you can easily walk over a line like that, which is using very ordinary language, if you're not paying attention, especially because the longer you read, the more likely you are, frankly, to be physiologically a little tired and a little more willing to maybe walk past these little hints, right? And it's at that point that we jump back to the opening days in Chevengur, where Prokofy and Chipurni are still living among these old Chevengurians and trying to figure out what exactly they need to do in order to bring about communism, especially how to stop this whole second coming thing. And as they're thinking high-mindedly, you'll notice that Prokofy goes around and says, okay, well, the first thing is we need to strip them of their property. So he goes around and basically robs the bourgeois elements of the town. I'm using bourgeois in quotes here, obviously, realistically. Obviously, in a more strict Marxist definition, there are no bourgeois elements to this town. You don't get the sense that anyone is a landlord. You don't get the sense that anyone is acquiring property beyond their own personal domicile. You get the sense that this is a fairly communal place, one of those kind of idealized cities by the old anarchists in Russia who said they've achieved communism there because they aren't living for themselves; they're living for the sake of the community. I don't think that's explicitly stated in the town, but you can kind of, when I'm reading it, I kind of get that's me reading into the text a little bit. I'm getting that vibe. And Prokofy and Chipurni decides that they need to. The second coming is actually a pretty good idea, but they need to organize it themselves. So Prokofy goes around, robs the so-called bourgeois elements of the town, and announces the second coming. And so they all gather, carrying just a few belongings. And Prokofy, with the Chekists, proceed to execute the crowd. They shoot them one by one. And this language, again, I got to emphasize, even though this is a longer passage, it does not make anything extraordinary. The people being shot and killed don't even find it to be extraordinary themselves. They simply sit there and be shot and fall down and die, or even fall down and complain about it. And there's even a moment here where even the Chekists seem to understand something is different, where they, quote, "The Chekists understood and felt agitated. With a bullet inside them, the bourgeoisie, just like the proletariat, wanted comradeship. Without a bullet, however, they loved only property." As they go around, they make sure everyone's dead by shooting them in the neck, which, of course, is where they believe the soul resides. So they can't just kill the bodies. They need to kill the souls of this old world. And it appears to be all the men, or the older men in the town, or at least most of them, because after that, the wives come and wail. It reminds me very much of the Akhmatova's lines about the wives of the murdered Streltsy from Requiem. But you have this weird interaction of this sort of the hard edge of Soviet power, the horrifying edge of Soviet power, the murder of an entire crowd, and yet also this mythical thinking that, of course, there must still be a soul, and of course, the soul must reside in the neck. So we must go around and shoot them all in the neck to kill that soul, kill that old world. And it's said all very matter-of-factly. Afterwards, jumping forward a little bit in the novel, they end up deciding that's not enough, so they expel the rest of the town, including people who at this point are clearly not bourgeois, even by the Soviet definition. The old Chevengurians have mostly been killed. What's left are their families. You have some people who have even worked for the Soviet in other areas who are they consider them, oh, you're part of the bourgeoisie too, right? They have no clear definition. They just push everyone out. Literally everyone. By the end of it, only the 11 members of the Revolutionary Committee, plus a woman named Klavdyusha, who is very outside. The rest of them, we'll talk about that more later. And even then, after they're sent out, one of the Revcom ends up machine gunning them all down as they're camping outside the city. But, as we jump back into the present, with Kopyankin wanting Sasha to come here and proclaim his judgment on the town, because he doesn't think this is communism, but he also doesn't trust his own understanding of communism. For him, communism is Rosa Luxemburg, but he also appears to understand that is not a full and true understanding of it. He's pursuing his own journey. So he wants Sasha to come and proclaim judgment. And one of the Revcom members, Lug, one of the... at this point in time, I'm going to be jumping back and forth, right? At this point in time, now the town is fuller for reasons we'll talk about. Now the town is a little fuller. People have started to arrive, although the timing is a little bit strange as you get into the novel. It doesn't quite make sense, and you might get caught up on that, but I don't think you should, because that's less important than, again, the characters' journeys themselves. The message dispatched eventually makes it to Sasha, who... says, okay, I guess I should go, maybe, I think I need to. But his father, Zakhar Pavlovich, remains very doubtful, and he says this line, quote, "And I can tell you one thing for sure, I can make anything out of iron, but there's no way I can make a communist out of a man." This is a very interesting difference that I'm going to note here. Zakhar is representative, maybe not, I don't want to say he's representative, but Zakhar here is representing a viewpoint of the building the happiness of man is about, building this new machinery. It is a failed viewpoint for him. It is one that he no longer holds to, but he still holds to the fact that he can still make things. He's a tinkerer and inventor by trade, and he can make things, but he's already come around to the belief that he can not make things that are changing people. Whereas Chepurny, he is not making things. They don't do any labor there, but he is working he's working to make a communist out of a man. He's working with the stuff of souls. These two, which I think if in other books, these two positions are conflated. Often you look at cement, for example, and the consciousness of the working people is entwined with the building of the cement factory, right? These two things are, if we build it, they will come, basically. If we build this factory, people will come around to understanding the importance of what we're doing. This labor will make them into better people. And here we have these two viewpoints entirely separate. Zakhar, the builder, so to speak, who is doubtful that can change a person's soul, and Chepurny, who thinks that has entirely... I'm not even going to try to create a simple definition of how Chepurny is thinking about operating on someone's soul. But he is working with that soul in this sort of, I don't want to say naturalistic way, right? The essence of building communism, removing everything from around a person, property that would get between them and sort of the advancement into their communism of their soul. So Divanov then decides he will go, although initially he's kind of back and forth. He sees Sonia again. You might recall Sonia from the first half. She's someone he kind of sort of grew up alongside. Had this will they won't they, there's sexual tension there, and she is off on her way to go be a teacher. And so he, despite the fact that there's still that sort of tension there between the two, they understand that their paths are diverging. And also Sasha dreams of his father, the man who had died looking for the secrets that the fish held, right? For whom death held no great mystery. The mystery is the secrets in and of it. The death is not this simple end. Death is simply one step in this journey for his father. And you could look at that as his own journey, this sort of mythological thinking, right? That there is a truth out there, and something in the world, the natural world, knows it, and he wants to go after it. Whereas, Sasha, Zakhar Pavlovich, they're not creatures of this more mythological era of thinking. They're creatures of this more modern, in quotes here, modern world. And so he, along with Gopner, decides to go to Chevengur to find this communism. And Gopner decides he wants to go because he, like many others, wants to find a communism that he can actually build with his own two hands. What is it? What is physical communism? What does that actually look like? They're all looking for this. From there, we return to Chevengur before Sasha arrives, and I just want to mention this little thing here because it's extremely funny. This is an extremely funny and horrific book in turns. often quite close together. So after the liquidation of the old town population, this is, again, jumping back in time a little bit. Excuse me. Again, timing in this thing is very weird. And so after the liquidation of the old town population, Prokofy reads Das Kapital to Cheporny as they're looking for a post hoc justification for their act, but Cheporny does not really understand it. What is this population that we've been dealing with? It doesn't really seem to fit with these theories. And then Prokofy says, well, I suppose that since, according to Karl Marx, they can't exist, I'm not saying that Marx himself wrote that, Karl Marx just simply never addresses it, then they should not exist. So they said, okay, so it was right that we did that because Marx never addressed it, so it can't exist, so we need to wipe it out. And so they say, okay, so the main idea they get is that we've done everything right and we don't need to learn anything more. And, quote, lest the book be read in vain, Cheporny left his written mark across the title, implemented in Chevengur up to the evacuation of the class of residual scum. Marx lacked the brains to write about them in his work. Future danger from them, however, is inevitable, and so we have taken our measures. Yet all the same, Cheporny wonders that even despite this solid understanding he thinks he has of communism, the fact that he's pretty certain they built it here in Chevengur, he wonders why everything seems so hard, although communism has already arrived. And you'll see this throughout the novel. All these characters feel better where they're in motion, when they're away from these towns and cities where things have, in their own small way, ended. All those towns and cities are constantly in this process of revitalizing in the actual world, right? Cities and towns are constantly rebuilding themselves, constantly reinventing themselves. That's the process of life, interacting with each other. Towns and cities in this novel are kind of dead things. They're kind of set. Despite the fact that, despite these attempts to change them, they are sort of an end of the road. There is no more road to walk on because you've already arrived. These open roads that make everyone else feel so better, Cheporny is not able to walk. Communism has already arrived here. There are no more roads to walk. And Cheporny even has this interesting moment where he realizes that life is harder for him than it was for the old Chevengurians because they don't have a history to call on. Quote, forgotten reserves from centuries of life of the soul helped the old inhabitants, the life of the soul, right? This is, the soul is not something that is exclusive to communists. The soul is something that's built within communities and people. In this understanding, I think, forgotten reserves from centuries of life of the soul helped the old inhabitants of Chevengur to bear the remnants of their lives with full dignity of patience and hope. But for Cheporny and his scarce comrades, where communism had not been written down, where it had not been made into a song they could understand and call on for comfort in the hour of danger, he had only the support of his own inspired heart, only its difficult strength with which to win the future, knocking our souls from the bourgeoisie's silenced bodies and embracing a blacksmith, now legging it along the road. That's when he meets a blacksmith. So it's at this point that they decide to expel everybody else in the town. Cheporny calls together his 12-strong council, though they really only consider themselves 11-strong because it's them and a woman named Klavdyusha. The rest are men. It's never explicitly says, but she's kind of sort of this sex object in the novel. Cheporny, you initially gets the sense that he kind of considers her his wife in the early novel, but as you begin to get back, you see that it's him pining for her. It's said that she's seen as a, quote, raw material for the men of the town, which to me has this sort of sexual undertone of that she is not really involved in the revolution the way the rest of them are. She is the raw material the rest of these 11 other men are working on. And it becomes clear that Cheporny barely has any interaction with her at all. In fact, she seems to spend most of her time with Prokofy, which was something we'll talk about more later. And I want to compare, there are very few women in this novel, so compare this Klavdyusha, who is barely present. I think there's only one point you ever actually hear her speak. Otherwise, you only hear her mentioned in passing for the most part, mostly with Prokofy going off to be alone with her. With Sonia, the teacher, who's very set into her ways and kind of exists on her own as her own force of will, which is something we'll talk about as well. And after everybody's expelled, they again lay awake through the long night. This is another thing that recurs through the novel. These characters at night, in this immense cold and fear, where they talk and play music to kind of expel that darkness for a little bit before they crawl and hold each other close together to find some sense of community, although it seems to be lacking, until the sun rises. And the day after this final expulsion, quote, somehow dawn was a long time coming, though surely it must have been time for a new day. Cheporny went still and began to feel afraid. Would the sun rise in the morning? Would morning ever come, now that the old world was no longer? And we have this moment of doubt here, this moment where now that the old soul, the old ways have been expelled, the sun, the ultimate proletarian, would it return? That is their communism. That is an essential feature, the proletarian who makes everything else work for them. Will it return to them now that they have done this? You could read that a lot of different ways. I'm going to leave it at the simple level of doubt in what's to come. This Chipurni, as we understand through the novel, he's the most malleable in a sense. While the other characters are fairly set in their ways and change only slightly, Chipurni is the one who has the most actual movement in his own ideas, thinking from initially his role as the person in this kind of more traditional Soviet sense is it's my role to dictate life to you to create communism to, well, everyone's going to walk to it on their own. So it's my role to remove all the obstacles in your path, which are property and labor and all these other things. And now that they've done this, he's not certain that communism will come, but now he's worried that the sun, their symbol of communism, will be gone forever. So they now in this empty town, they begin to push houses back to kind of reorganize the town, and they send Prokofy out to find the proletariat, to find this new world for them. So they put up a sign, and they have this little episode where they hear something out in the darkness, and they sally out with guns in hand to fight these revanchists who are coming to take back communism from them. And they find instead a young woman singing inside a boilerplate, and they decide, there's no room for her here, and so they end up just kicking it down a ravine. This young woman who they say is like, oh, she's mad, whatever. Music, art has no place here. They're building communism. There is only place for that building. Outside elements are not welcome. And so finally, after a while, Prokofy returns with a large crowd. These people are characterized by their otherness, by their feature of being from an other group. Not proletarians, it seems to Chipurni, but also not bourgeoisie, seems to be the only two classes there can be. These people are in the novel characterized by their otherness because they exist outside normal family structure. And I don't mean in the sense that, like, oh, they don't have a nuclear family, so they didn't grow up right. They are characterized by being completely alone in the world. Abandoned before birth by their father, abandoned slightly after birth by their mother. They've had to work their entire lives dependent only upon themselves. And to remember that communism for Chipurni is this question of comradeship, of how do we remove the barriers between people and themselves, right? This community of common cause. And this is something that people have for the most part, whether they're proletarians or bourgeoisie, by the nature of family or community ties, but these people do not have that. They're wanderers. And as he's seeing that, Chipurni also, I will note, has another thought, quote, he discovered for himself a reassuring secret, that rather than gazing at nature with admiration, the proletariat destroys it. So we have a little bit of this view that, again, the world is something to be modified to fit socialism, right? Rather than, this is kind of in line with how Sasha is seeing it, although Sasha is more, we can kind of master the world, whereas Chipurni is like, when we need communism, we're moving the houses around away so we can have big squares, we're moving the orchards closer, we are I said terraforming earlier, maybe that's the wrong thing for Sasha Dvanov, because he is thinking of kind of building structures on Earth, whereas Chipurni is thinking of completely changing it to fit the power of the proletariat. And so this large crowd begins to settle in the town and then takes on the action, as we see in the present time, of doing nothing, of basically wandering around town. And this is the very thing that Kopyankin is very doubtful about, because he says, quote, what you have here is not communism. What's brought it into being is neglect and desolation. People were wandering around with no life. They found their way here, and now they live without movement. Without movement, Kopyankin feels better on the road, but these people are not only in a place without roads, they are barely moving around themselves because they're not doing anything. They're not preparing for the winter. They're not growing any food. They're not even repairing leaks in their houses. They're just sitting around. And it seems clear to Kopyankin that they care not at all for communism, or just simply this is a place to sleep. Although he does sort of envy them in a strange way, especially there's an old man among them, Yakov Titich, who becomes more important. And the key thing that happens here is that a mother and a young son comes into town, and Kopyankin meets them and brings them into a house, and the child is dying. And we have this interesting scene where the mother and the child left alone interact, and this child seems to talk to the mother, although it's a child of only 2 or 3 years of age, as if it is an adult, which the mother does not seem to respond to exactly. The mother responds as if the child had said something much simpler, even though the child talks very articulately and says, "Mother, please don't let them eat me after I die." He's not only articulate, he's almost prophetic in his manner of speech, especially this fear that he'll be eaten, right? And coming from a time of famine that, when there's no food, people will do will commit acts of cannibalism for the sake of survival. And then the child actually does die, and that death drives home for Kopyankin the conclusion that communism has failed here, because half of his conception of communism is about the comradely aspect, which is lacking, but also he looks around and said, how could this, if you have communism here, of all those bad things that we've been fighting against are supposed to be ended in communism, and you say communism has arrived here, how could it be the case that this child has died if you have communism? Obviously, it couldn't be the case that communism would allow this, so you must not have communism. And this is a question which the rest have no answers for. And after this moment of not being able to answer him, Chevengur wanders back to the woman, and he wants to see, just in case, the social conditions of communism have brought the late boy back to life. And he begins to talk to her, and she's woken. He wakes her up, and she says that she was dreaming of her son. And Chevengur grows super excited. He says, "So even if you were not totally able to stop the death of this child, it lived on a little longer, even if only in dream." And to this, the mother chastises him, and she says, "Quote, no, my child isn't precious to you. What matters to you is some sort of thought of your own. Go away and leave me. I'm used to being left on my own. I've still got a long time to lie with him until morning. Don't waste my last hours with him." And he leaves that house, even though he's been chastised. He's completely content. Quote, Chevengur left the beggar woman's house, content that, even if only in dream, only in his mother's mind, the boy had lived on with a remnant of his soul, and not died in Chevengur immediately, and it operated independently of people. But where was it located? So you've got this reassurance of someone who's questioning a little bit, really getting at the question of what is communism. And not only is it something the book is asking, it's something that Chevengur is asking himself. What is communism? What is this stuff of souls? But he's certain it must be a good thing. And he brings this news to the rest, and they begin to celebrate this and says, even if the child did die, if the people who are the members of the Revolutionary Committee say this child in this dream had kept walking with his mother before deciding to lay down and die in the dream. This is a decision the child makes in the dream. So what this must mean is that this child could not die until it had reached Chevengur, where the child had the freedom to choose to die, right? This is a freedom that communism has brought us. And Kopyankin and Yakov Titich are pretty doubtful of that point of view. And amid all of that, Prokofiev leans over, and this is where you really get the sort of sense of revulsion of Prokofiev. He's not interested in this talk at all. The rest of them are seriously engaging with this. Prokofiev, it matters not to him. He begins to tell the man next to him about the stories of all these women he's known, and that which carries an obviously sexual undertone, and also a somewhat transactional one, as he tells the story of this woman who is, and he talks her up as being an educated woman. They're not talking about this sort of crass, like, oh, she was super hot, this amazingly attractive woman. He says, oh, she was a very educated woman, but I wanted to have her, but she wanted food from me, and I had my own family to feed. So you get this really repulsive sort of view of Prokofiev as someone who's tracking down this ideal of his, these educated women, and finding desperate ones who he wants to sleep with, and they say, well, they're seem to be bargaining with what they have in a time of great need. And he's kind of telling this as this funny story of this very repulsive thing, getting back to Mearson's argument that if you read past that, this very small line, I think it's only 2 or 3 sentences, you might not notice the kind of horrific implications of Prokofiev's very normal language. So they're all uncertain, and they turn to Chevengur and ask, "What do we do now?" And he says, "Giving you orders as czarist. Find your own way." Soon after that, Sasha and Gopner arrive in town, and he sees Kopyankin, and they have this really interesting moment, which we'll talk about later, of this intense emotion they have for each other. In fact, he's so ashamed of how strongly he feels about Kopyankin is that he looks away from him, which also shames Kopyankin, wondering what that's about. But moments later, he kind of grabs hold of him and begins to cry on him, this beloved friend who is not seen in some time. And Gopner, much like everyone else who's arrived in town, is pretty perplexed by the claim of communism. Remember, he's coming from the capital where they're dealing with communism on the bureaucratic level, whereas here there is absolutely nothing of the sort. And Chevengur explains it to him, "Well, here, Comrade Gopner, people have only one profession, the soul, and we've decreed life itself to take the place of work. What do you think? Does that seem all right to you?" And here we have this in this chapter, we also have a greater dimension added to the moon, right? Whereas the sun is the ultimate proletarian, and in the nighttime, the moon is this kind of somewhat terrifying time, this time of questions. It begins to take on greater character. Quote, Chevengur is one and only laborer, the luminary of warmth, comradeship, and communism settled down for the night. The moon, luminary of the lonely, luminary of wanderers who wander in vain, gradually began to shine in place. I think this takes greater presence, because at this point we have been introduced to the people, the others, as they're constantly referred to. They never talk about them as the proletarians. They're always the others. These are the wanderers. They wandered through life without family, without friends, always relying on themselves, entirely lacking the character of comradeship. And so they begin to demand, the others begin to demand, you need women to be brought to this town. It's entirely men except for Klabdyusha. Prokofy sets out to do this task, but before doing that, he opines to Sasha that, women are just going to get in the way of building communism, and Cheporny is giving too much to the masses, and they need to be only given pieces in order to be loved. Because if you give them everything, the moment you don't give them everything they want, then they're going to turn on you. Whereas if you just dole out little pieces and say, well, social conditions are preventing us from giving more, then they learn to expect that, so they aren't disappointed. Again, Prokofy is walking this path of this very transactional, intellectual communism by proclamation, but Sasha does not understand at all. This is not Sasha's point of view. He is very personal, most caring. He's probably the most caring person in the novel. He has come to Chevengur not necessarily out of personal interest, but because he is driven by a need to help Zakhar Pavlovich, his sort of adoptive father, although I guess he did have an adoptive father, his adoptive father after his original adopted father, who did not do a very good job. He's driven by this sense of empathy for people, by this want to help people. You'll notice that his is the most grounded, right, of all these communisms. Kopyankin is this off on his heroic journey. Cheporny is concerned with the soul, but he's not concerned with people so much. Just how can we get them to this question of the soul? It's this question of comradeship. Zakhar Pavlovich has kind of given up on has wanted to help people, wanted his technologies to help that, but has kind of given up on that notion. Sasha's actual father is concerned with the very personal, mythic finding of truth, and Sasha is one of the few who's really concerned with these questions because they can help people, help his father. So Sasha does not understand Prokofy's intricate ideas of how to lead people, because he's simply looking for this answer of how do we make people happy. And as Sasha is kind of viewing the town here, he comes to understand something. Quote, and Sasha understood why Cheporny and the Chevengur Bolsheviks so desired communism. It was the end of history, the end of time. Time moves only in nature, while men can't escape melancholy. And so we have this extra element for Sasha, is that he is thinking, well, as Cheporny, you've got all these, this is why I love this novel, you've got all these viewpoints that in other novels might be conflated. They're very distinct in this novel. Cheporny's view of terraforming is not the same view as Sasha's view of making the world work for people. But Sasha, again, is coming around, and his thoughts are evolving too, although he's not changing drastically in the same way that Cheporny is kind of pinballing back and forth between these other ideas. Pinballing is maybe overstating it, but he is coming to understand this question of people's feelings, not just the vague idea of soul and comradeship. Men can't escape melancholy. That's something that's driving them together forward as well. He can see that, and it's not something that others can. And there's this real moment of change in the stillness of the town when Yakov Titich falls to an illness. And as they go to him, they end up doing the first work they've done in a long time. Gopner gets a hammer and goes up and fixes the roof because it's raining, and they don't want the rain to fall on Yakov Titich. And they decide, well, we need to build a fire so we can make a soup, because they've run out of matches a long time ago. So we need to stop kind of eating things we're grazing. We need to cook him something that really is healthy for him. And although the next day they are not able to get that spark, Gopner helps them start using a hydro pump that they have in order to try to get that spark. And they start doing work. They start doing labor, not for any real reason. None of them are told to. They just, after everyone sees Gopner climb up to the roof and fix it for the sake of Yakov Titich, they all start doing things as well for the sake, the sense that they also need to do something for Yakov Titich. Cheporny noticed this, quote, Cheporny felt even more shamed than the others, since he was accustomed to thinking that property had lost its value in Chevengur and that the proletariat, therefore, was not firmly united. But their inner beings, it seemed, still lived separately and were helplessly afflicted by suffering. People then could not detect the presence of communism. It had not yet become an intermediary substance between the inner beings of proletarians. Returning again to Fyodorov, this question of the common cause, what can truly bring people together? Chaporny wants to know, and he thought before removal of property could do it, but he now sees, and he's ashamed to see, that even though property is no longer a factor, there is still this divide between people. There's no communism, again, and now he's thinking of it as this substance between people, comradeship as this thing that's linking them. And this becomes a turning point as people begin to recognize, oh, autumn's coming, winter will be soon after that. We need to start chopping wood for fires. And up to that point, Chaporny had basically been arguing against doing any labor and says, we don't need to cut any wood for fires in the winter because when snow falls, that will retain heat in the houses, so you need to do nothing at all. The world itself is providing, the means for communism, and you doing labor is working against that. But spontaneously, all these people begin doing labor. And the key thing to know here is that these people are not laboring for the sake of the community at large. They're not laboring looking forward to autumn thinking, oh, we need to prepare for autumn to survive. They all kind of pick someone in their mind, a comrade, and they begin doing that labor for them in their mind. Głopner is trying to get a spark from the pump in order to start making a soup for Yakov Titich. And this is put into words by Sasha when he goes for a walk and, quote, with another member and asks him if he's thinking, what's the other member's not. And, quote, what Sasha meant by thinking was not the consideration of ideas, but the constant imagination of beloved objects. And his main beloved objects were now the people of Chevengur. He saw their pathetic, naked torsos as the essence of socialism that he and Kopyankin had searched for in the steppe and now found. So he goes out and sees a good spot for agriculture and says, we need to build a dam. And he goes and tells that to some other people, and they say, oh, that's a good idea. We need to make a foundation for the dam as well. And so they all start thinking about all these things that are actually necessary for the survival of this town, for the sake of other people. Quote, each other was working not for himself, but for someone else. Someone had seen Głopner mend the roof over Yakov Titich. So this is sort of this breaking point after the early sort of horrors of Chaporny and Chevengur, where they go in and kill everybody in the town and bring a bunch of people in and say, okay, now that property is no longer in the way, you now have communism. And as Chaporny is ashamed to realize now, the mere taking away of property is not what has brought people together. It's this moment of helping another person, something done by Głopner, an outsider to these initial arrivals. Chaporny, again, changing his view. He's on this, even though he is at the end of history, he's on this mental pathway, whereas Sasha is a lot more consistent, right? He is consistently driven by the search for finding communism that helps people. And so these points of view are starting to come into reality. We start to get to this utopian ideal in a sense, although it's obviously one that, as Bethia argued at the beginning, right, the anti-utopian impulse is the one that is concerned about the state impositions in a sense, or the impositions that are necessary to get to that utopia. And obviously, Chevengur engages with that. In its own understated way, there are horrible things that have happened up to this point. But all the same, these new arrivals who have maybe not a firmer understanding of communism, but have a firmer understanding of each other, help cross that line into building this comradeship between each other. I will also note here that two women arrive, which is not a big part of the story, but they go around trying to sort of hire themselves out as wives. But at this point, even though initially the others were demanding wives, which is kind of considered to be a counter-revolutionary question to ask, when they go around and try to hire themselves out, none of them are interested, not for any particular reason, but because they're all working on their projects for the most part, and they can't be bothered. And so the women later depart. At this point in the novel, in the 11th hour, we meet our final protagonist of the novel, Simon Serbinov, who is in Moscow. He's an engineer who's been working at the rural masses. He kind of reflects Platonov himself, who is somewhat doubtful of communism. Not that he is doubting the system in place, but he is doubtful because he thought that he would feel better, feel different, feel full in this new society, and he doesn't. During that, he meets Sonia, the Sonia earlier from the novel, who's now a Moscow resident, and she sticks out to him because, quote, it was clear to him that she did not miss other people. She could get nourishment from her own life, which he had never been able to do himself. If she needed others, it was not because she wanted from them anything she herself lacked. It was, rather, that she needed to expend her own superfluous strength. So let's look at her in contrast to the other main woman of the novel. The main woman of the novel is maybe not a good way to put it, but there are not a lot of women in this novel, right? Not a lot of women who get characterization. Not a lot of women who get names. For the most part, it's Sonia and Klavdusha. Whereas Klavdusha is this quote unquote raw material, this object that is acted upon. Sonia is a beacon. Sonia is sure of herself in a way that almost no one else in this novel is. Everyone else is searching, but she is kind of unique because she isn't. She doesn't even, she is sort of an other in the same way that the others in town are who have never known people, but she's not other because she's never known people, never known family, never known community. She just simply doesn't need it. She's so strong in herself that even if someone were to go away, she does not feel bad or sad about it because she herself is living this full life, which is something that Simon is both attracted to and kind of repulsed by. But he falls into her orbit and they continue to meet. He even is meant to be dispatched to Chevengur to assess how things are going because they've heard that crop fall off the crop growth has fallen off, but he stays and misses his train because he wants to keep meeting Sonia, who he has this immense sexual attraction to, even that's something that's not really mentioned in the novel. He steals her linens, smelling them, and keeps inviting her out, and he gets the sense that she's like just going along with it, right? They continue doing that for several days until finally he takes her to his mother's grave, which is the death of his own mother, something that deeply affects him. And he's trying to explain to her why this has affected him so deeply, why this has left this hole in his soul that he's been searching for without success. And she doesn't seem to understand it. And so he walks around clearly trying to engage in a sexual encounter, which she is not very receptive to, but eventually he kind of loses his patience trying to find a private area, and he takes her back to his mother's grave where they have sex on top of it. Although I don't know if sex is the right way to sell it. Sonia does not seem very, not that she doesn't seem receptive. It's that she kind of, him kind of engaging with like, oh, I want to have sex with you. She just kind of seems to like turn her head over and says, okay, so be it. Her strength of character is not coming from this sort of baser sense of anything. She does not seem to desire sex as this sort of strength of character thing, right? That she does not need other people to that degree. While Simon is, lost in it. He's missing his mother. He's full of grief. This new reality is not what he thought it to be. He wants Sonia. He wants this life, but she doesn't need him. And that kind of simultaneously makes him angry and attracted to her. And so they have this very necrophilic, I guess, encounter. Not literally necrophilic, but, it's hard to, I don't even know what to do. Having sex on top of your mother's grave. I don't know whether they call that necrophilic, incestuous, or that's something I can't. That's something you're gonna have to talk about on your own. I don't have a full understanding of that. I guess I probably could come up with one, right? This reduction, sort of. Not that I think this sexual encounter serves as a sort of sense of his baser desires, whereas Sonia, who is kind of above it, is just like, okay, if you must, if these baser desires are something that you need to in this place of great emotion to you, it's almost the shameful thing. But eventually he does leave, and Chevengur is continuing its labors. Even the night itself, right? This moon is not just a luminary of these wandering wanderers. Now the night is entirely habitable and comfortable for all of them. And Simon arrives, and everyone begins to pat him down, take his stuff, and make gifts for other people. And he is the only person that night who is lonely in town. The other Chevengurians have found comradeship among each other by helping each other. Simon does not have that. He's got this hole in himself. And he talks to Sasha the next day and says this thing. And says, quote, "Do you have grief or sadness in Chevengur?" he asked. And Sasha said that they did. Grief and sadness. They too were part of a man's body. And so you have this evolution of the idea of communism from Chevengur, or from Simon, who's walking his own path, that communism should mean this banishment of unhappiness, this feeling of this hole in his soul. And Sasha kind of is treating him almost like a child here and says, no, of course communism doesn't mean the bad thoughts will all go away. Those are all part of the experience of life. That's part of us. Communism is something that comes from the soul, right? That is something that is from the fullness of the soul, not just the bright light parts. Again, Simon is the most actually educated character in this novel. Prokofiev is the one who comes next, and I would say he intellectualizes, but he's not really understanding. Well, Simon does understand, and he's schooled in theory. He knows how Soviets work. He's looking around and says, where's the bureaucracy? And so he writes back. He sends a letter to Sonia and his boss. And he writes back to Sonia and mentioning that he's found Sasha, because before he leaves, Sonia mentions that he should look for Sasha. He suspects it's Sasha, but he does not actually address it until the very end of the novel, because she admires Sasha because he's kind of like her in a sense, in that he is someone who makes other people feel fuller to her, right? She says if more men were like him, there would be no need for marriage. And confuses Simon. And she says, well, it seems to be the case that when you're around him, all these other petty concerns kind of fall away and you just kind of feel full around him. There'd be no need for marriage because these desires that drive us to these things would already be fulfilled. And so, Sonia's kind of this elevated figure in that sense. And so is Sasha in a way, although we obviously give an inner life to him that Sonia is not given in the novel. But that this kind of true communism, in a sense, at least in the view of Sonia, is this being full. And this is something the novel as a whole is engaging with, this fullness that people are bringing each other. And Sasha is a person who just naturally seems to have that, at least in her language. Sasha himself obviously does not see himself that way. After that, Prokofy arrives with a group of women, and they are meant to be married. And this is very obviously, it's also, too, a frightening thing just to be brought along in a group and say, okay, these are all the ones you're going to marry. And everyone's kind of uncertain what to do. And so they have a ceremony where they do a kissing lineup where they go around and everybody kisses each other. And Sasha says, even though the intent is for them to marry, this is what the others have asked for, Sasha proclaims that, well, maybe it would be better, again, getting away from this idea of sexual relationships that a marriage might imply. He proclaims that they would be better mothers, in this sense of like, well, we need to, this comradeship is this sort of family, right? They're better for these women to be mothers to us. And then there's this that's an old trope, right? This sense of a woman needs to be this nurturing, matronly woman to develop a man. But he also has this very interesting realization. Quote, then Sasha realizes that the women were all orphans too. They are others as well. It would be better if they, first of all, chose brothers or fathers from among the Chevengurians, and let their say be final. And as the women are described, you never get their perspective, but you do get the sense that they are very much like the others. They are hungry, tired, beaten down by life, although they have the additional burden that it seems that they have been trading away themselves, like that they have been used to trading themselves sexually for survival in the same way that Prokofy predates on or talks about predating on earlier. And so the novel allows them kind of the dignity of saying they didn't believe that one bit. Quote, not one woman believed in the Chevengurians' fatherhood or brotherhood. So they all wanted a husband whose only need was sleep and a warm place. And so they all go off and they create these small family units. Klavdyusha is clearly unhappy with this arrangement and says so to Prokofy, which I think is the first and only time we actually hear from her in the novel. And he tells her that he is going to acquire the town, all the property that's given away. They're going to put it in her name and her aunt's name, and that she will own it all. Prokofy is clearly this transactional type. This is coming through, and he's almost a revanchist too. He's actually planning on taking these things away, making property property is still between him and the people, essentially, right? And he wants that. He's always been taking. He stole the stuff from the so-called bourgeoisie before he murdered them. In Klavdyusha, in opposition to Sonia, you can read Prokofy in opposition to Sasha in the same way that I read Klavdyusha in opposition to Sonia. She's the recipient of this. She's not happy with this new communism, whereas Sonia is a paragon of this new communism. And finally, Simon goes to Sasha and tells him about Sonia, and says, she remembers you. I've noticed that here in Chevengur, people are like ideas for one another. And for her, you are an idea. Peace of soul comes to her from you. You're an act of warmth. And in that moment, Sasha also suddenly understands and seems to make peace with the fact that his notion of he still kind of seems to have held on to that notion where a future where he and Sonia might marry, and he understands suddenly that is dead forever. And it's just something that he comes with a strange feeling of grief, but also one he gets over fairly quickly. For him, he's also kind of approaching this status of paragon in the same way that she is, that this life is not about these baser concerns. Despite all that, right, we have this characterization of this time of Chevengur as becoming a more accepting, warm place. Earlier on in the novel, you may recall we talked about that girl in a barrel singing who the Revcom kicks into a ravine because there's really no place for singing or music. Now, Chapourny even starts making statues of people who he misses or he's not seen in a little bit. And they're not very good statues, but he's expressing himself through art. That's something that after Sasha's arrival, Sasha is actually changing the people around him, right? They're changing slightly in relation to him because of him and Gopner's arrival and Gopner fixing the roof. Everyone else is spurned into action by seeing and feeling shamed by their lack of connection to one another, and they begin to live for each other. So you're seeing, again, I would invite you back to look at these roads all these characters are walking. And Sasha still gets the unique one of having the most empathy, the most stated empathy of anyone in this novel. Empathy in the sense of not just caring about other people's feelings. Obviously, now the other Chevengurians do too, but he is the one who demonstrates the most ability to understand other people's ways of thinking, and not just other people. He begins to understand kind of the world as a system, in a sense. He goes off to make a trebuchet to protect the town, and he has there's this very tender scene where he is searching through all these empty houses, and, quote, Sasha unearthed a variety of dead things, worn-out shoes, wooden barrels that had contained tar, deceased sparrows, and much else. Sasha picked these objects up, voiced his regret at their demise and oblivion, and then returned them to their former places, so that everything in Chevengur would remain whole until a better day of redemption and communism. So for Sasha, they're not at communism yet, unlike Chapourny, who firmly believes that they've already arrived at this end of history. But he is careful to even preserve dead sparrows and on old barrels, because one day these will be brought out when we are in the world of communism. They will be redeemed. And he's living for everyone else. Quote, Sasha possessed no reserve of fixed love. He lived by Chevengur alone, and he was afraid of expending the town. He existed only by means of everyday people, Kopyankin, Gopner, Pashintsev, and the others. But he constantly worried that they might all disappear somewhere one morning, or else die off gradually. Sasha bent down, plucked a blade of grass, and examined its timid body. When no one else was left, this grass was something he could preserve. Now, this line exists, in my mind, in conversation with a much earlier line, which I have not talked about. This is right when he arrives back in the capital city to talk to Shumilin in this now feasting city, and there's this moment when they're talking, we hear a little bit about an alarm clock. An alarm clock who was working away on the table, and Shumilin secretly envied it. The clock never stopped laboring while he himself had to interrupt his life in order to sleep. Dvanov, however, did not envy time. He sensed he had a reserve of life, and he knew he would be able to overtake the movement of the clock. So he's living for himself. He's got this reserve of life, and he's kind of is going to beat these things that concern other people. Whereas at the end, now he's not living by his own reserve. He's living by love of the town. There is no reserve of, he's talking about fixed love here, but before he's talking about that fixed reserve within himself. He is putting himself wholly into this town, which makes it all the harder in the next chapter when men on horseback arrived and kill everybody in town, save for Sasha and Prokofy, although he does not know about the latter's survival. Sasha then, surviving this battle, mounts Strength of the Proletariat, who returns without his command to and rides him to the town where he grew up, and he walks into the same pond or river where his father had killed himself. And although it's never directly stated, the text implies that he himself follows his father's path and drowns himself by saying he's went to go search for the same secrets his father had. And at the very end of the novel, Strength of the Proletariat returns to Chevengur to find Zakhar Pavlovich searching for Sasha. And he sees Prokofy, and he says to him, "Want me to give you a ruble again? Go and find Sasha." This again calls back to earlier in the novel when he sees Prokofy as a child and asks him to find Sasha, for which Prokofy does for a ruble. And then Prokofy, who's sitting and crying upon the remains, says, "No, I'll bring him for free." And he set off in search of Sasha Dvanov. Oh, sorry, that was this is getting long. I should start to wrap up, but there's still some things I want to talk about. We have this. First of all, let's go back to Bethia's argument that this is a work of failed utopianism. This nearness to it that is ultimately undone at the end. Now, I think it's Bethia who argues that these, even though when they arrive, the people in Chevengur identify them as cadets, or the liberal opposition in the Civil War. He argues that they might instead be the Red Army itself coming to destroy Chevengur because of how unorthodox it is. To me, I don't think there's. I didn't see anything in the text that suggests it. I can see why you wouldn't necessarily trust them in being able to identify cadets on sight. Kopyankin, I think, is the only actual veteran among them. I don't think he has an opinion on it. He merely rides out to its defense. But this is one of the things where I don't want you to get caught up. I see people get caught up on who came and killed them, and I don't think that's a question that matters. They are ultimately, this burgeoning, hopeful society is ultimately cut down by an external force. That is the thing that matters, and how Sasha reacts. And Sasha, despite his thoughts that this grass is that without the people he can still preserve the grass, his tenderness leads him to kind of give up, and so he retreats from these higher ideals, and he goes back to the pond where his father killed himself, and he goes in search of the same secrets. Now, I've seen other people argue that there's an ambiguity as to whether or not he actually kills himself. Even though it's technically ambiguous, it's pretty hard for me personally to see any reading where that line implies anything else. This failed utopianism is disappointed in it. This Chevengur, although it's not, maybe it makes more sense if it is the Red Army, but again, I don't think there's textual evidence for that. It's ambiguous, and maybe that's part of the reason. Maybe that was intentional, that ambiguity. But the utopia doesn't work out, and it's not the end of history. However, all the same, it doesn't end on that. It ends on Zakhar Pavlovich searching for his son and finding Prokofy, this character, this figure who has up to this point been this pretty repulsive transactional person. And upon being asked, so can I give you a ruble to go find Sasha? He says, no, I'll bring him for free. He has changed. Something about this massacre has changed something within him. And although we don't get great insight into it, we get the sense that something has happened to him. And so he goes off in search of Sasha Divanov. And that is, to me, ultimately kind of hopeful, even though Sasha, he will almost certainly not find Sasha. Sasha has, in the text of this novel, almost certainly killed himself. It kind of suggests it's failed utopianism, but I will argue one that still has this sort of hint of optimism to it, a very faint optimism, and if you read it out, a very like an optimism that will not be rewarded. There is no Sasha to find. What could even lead him back to the town where they came from? He will probably not find him, but he will go search, and that is his path now. That is his road. This search for something that is probably almost certainly dead, although it's not exactly stated so. And that's where Chevengur ends. It is this reconceptualization of Fyodorov's argument that we can avert this end of history by building this common cause is almost there, but it ends up being crushed. And you can read into that Platonov's own experiences working in these regions, seeing these hopeful eras, but also being crushed by local corruption. Maybe that's a point in favor of understanding the Horsemen as Red Army, but again, that's not in the text. I think that is reading a little bit too much extra textually. But I could see why you might come to that conclusion or that understanding. There's other things I want to talk about. There's another article which I will encourage you to read, which is from the book I've referenced it before, Men Without Women. What is it? Masculinity and Revolution in Russian Fiction, 1917 to 1929. This article, Chevengur, Buried in the Family Plot, by Elliot Borenstein, who talks about sort of the homoeroticism throughout the novel, although not a traditional homoeroticism. It kind of lacks that dimension of there's naked men throughout this novel, and something that is viewed and mentioned and talked upon a lot, and a lot of physical interaction between men, at night, gripping each other and kind of groping at each other, and talking about like, well, stop groping me so, and men like arranging each other so they can sleep better, not they themselves, but so their comrade in arms, so to speak, can sleep better. This concern for them. So this is not a kind of voyeuristic sort of homoeroticism. In fact, Borenstein talks more about this intense feelings that these men have for each other, which is sort of disrupted by the presence of women. Right, we recall when Sasha and Kopyankin meet each other, Sasha feels so strongly that he can't even look at Kopyankin and then cries on him for that feeling. Whereas, which Borenstein argues is part of this sort of rising up of this deep connection that needs to be built between fathers and sons and comrades. And in this case, you also see Sonia, for example, kind of being this desire for the others to get married is seen as sort of this base anti-revolutionary desire, and of the few women who appear, the one who comes out the best, who Sonia is, has kind of gone above that idea that we need to get married. She is certain and of herself. She looks at Sasha and sees someone who brings such fullness to others that they wouldn't need to get married because all those desires would go away among the presence of men like him. Right, but in this case, Sonia and Klavdyusha it is reductive in that sense, right? The women, Sonia and Klavdyusha, are less themselves, and they are archetypes who are either to be looked upon well or to be rejected, whereas the men get to be much fuller human beings in all of this, and it kind of ends up as sort of threats to male comradeship, and only end up not being a threat when the women who arrive at the end are then are meant to take on their male companions as fathers or brothers, so to speak. Borenstein goes into much greater detail in that article. I would highly encourage you to read it. But for now, I'm going to leave it here because this has gone on for far too long already. But if you've gotten this far, thank you for listening. Before I completely wrap up, what's coming next? We're talking about Sasha Sokolov's A School for Fools, an interesting novel, this sort of stream of consciousness, although I hesitate to call it that for reasons you will hear in the episode to come, narrative about a man and his double. It is super interesting. We're going to be talking about it with Jose Vergara, I think is a 4-time returning now on the podcast. It's a great, we recorded this a while back, and I've been so excited to be able to release this. So you should look forward to that. But for now, to help keep the show independent, you can head on over to SlavicLitPod.com. You help keep the lights on. It really means a lot for anyone who can kick in, although I understand certainly that the goal of this podcast is to keep education free, and that is what we will always be. And I do want to extend a sincere thank you to everyone who does contribute. As always, the music used in this episode was Staraya Kino by Peremotka. You can find more of their stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify. The links and spelling are in the show notes. You'll hear from me again soon.